Hey, yo, what's up, everyone? Welcome back to the channel. This is Smart TCG, and today I'm going to be going over my Prismatic Evolutions tier list. Now, Prismatic Evolutions is the brand new set that is going to be releasing. Today, I'm going to be going over where I think the metagame is going to shape up. We're doing a booster box giveaway as well as we get closer to 10,000 subscribers. We will be announcing that shortly. So if you enjoy the content, make sure to leave a like and subscribe. And I'll be posting about that soon with details. Anyways, hopping into it here, we got tier S, A, B, C, and D. We got plenty of decks here as well. The metagame has changed quite a bit despite Prismatic Evolutions not being necessarily a very large set. There is some big changes that are going to be happening. So let's dive right into it. We're going to start off here with some of the new archetypes being Flareon EX and Jolteon EX. Unfortunately, these are not some of the strongest cards in the set. More or less, I feel like they are collectible cards. And I don't think they're going to necessarily be super competitive, but they are pretty cool. Hopping into some of the other decks, we're going to start with Regidrago. Regidrago was arguably considered the strongest deck in the previous format, the Surging Sparks format. Regidrago just dominating tournament after tournament. However, with the addition of Budu being able to item lock, it shuts down a lot of Regidrago and a lot of cards that makes Regidrago so powerful. Things like Energy Switch, Earthen Vessel, Prime Catcher. So many important cards get shut down due to the Budu, which really hurts this deck. Now, I do think there will be some ways to work around this. You have things like the Power Glass you could play. You could potentially play Rotom, just some slower type of variant, but not having as much aggression as you used to, I think definitely hurts the deck. So at the moment, we're going to put Regidrago at tier B. I think this deck is not going to completely fall off. I think there are some people who are saying the deck is going to just, completely fall off and it's not really good next format. I don't think that's the case. I think the deck is still fundamentally powerful, and I think that is going to carry it more than I think some people expect. So yeah, Regidrago, tier B deck, not as good as it used to be, but still very powerful. Next up here, we got Archlodon. Now, this is a deck that has been seeing quite a bit of success in Japan. Most recently won the Champions League with around like 5,000 players. So won a giant tournament, gets significantly better. And the main thing that it gains is it doesn't really get affected by Budu that much. And that's such a powerful card in the upcoming format, being able to item lock for 0 energy. So that's a big thing that it has, going for it. It takes decent matchups against a lot of the other top decks in the format. Regidrago has pretty much always been a solid matchup. So having a good, matchup versus, Regidrago is good. And you do well against a lot of, one prize decks just because you have, healing, things like Fluffy do well against. You got plenty of decent matchups. So yeah, I think Regidrago falling off kind of hurts the deck a little bit, but I still think it's fundamentally very good. And just how, decks are being built, this deck doesn't necessarily have to change a whole lot. Due to the item lock threat. Now, a deck that does have to change a lot due to Budu is going to be Charizard. Charizard is a deck that I still think is powerful. However, it has to completely change how it's built. Instead of playing 1 Charmeleon, you need to play 2. Instead of playing, 0 Pidgeot, you got to play Pidgeotto now. The A-spec of choice is most likely going to have to be Grand Tree, simply because Budu turns off Rare Candy. So if you are playing the old variant with 4 Rare Candy, 1 Charmeleon, most lists don't play the Pidgeotto, and you don't play Grand Tree, if they item lock you, you just lose a lot of the time. So there's not a whole lot that you can do about that in some situations. So I think that you do need to kind of alter how this deck is built, and I think that it's still good, still fundamentally powerful. The changes that you're making to the deck don't make the deck significantly worse. It just changes, how the deck is played. You could potentially even play something like the TM Evolution as well. I know some other decks are choosing to play that card to try and counteract the item lock. Next up here, we got Raging Bolt. Raging Bolt, I think, is a tier B deck. Still solid, just a turbo deck in the format. However, item lock really can slow this deck down, can give decks like Dragapult that oftentimes heavily rely on that item lock the turn or 2 that they need to set up. So I think that's a problem. However, you do relatively decently against things like the Archlodon. You're relatively consistent. I think it's just one of the better turbo decks in general. I think it will definitely show up and see some success. Next up here, we got Ceruledge. I think Ceruledge is quite good in this format. It's another deck that really isn't necessarily affected by item lock. Takes a pretty good Dragapult matchup as well. You're just able to do so much damage. You don't really put a whole lot of liabilities on the board as well. So things like Dusknoir and Phantom Dive aren't necessarily as effective too. So yeah, I think that Ceruledge is definitely good. I think that with potentially decks like Charizard, losing some popularity, I do think that it helps out this deck quite a bit. And with things like the Archlodon and also the Dragapult, which are expected to be very popular, those matchups are relatively good for Ceruledge too. So you do gain some pretty good matchups overall, which is nice. Next up here, we got Iron Thorns. Iron Thorns, in my opinion, is now dead, unfortunately. It's not entirely dead. Like, I think it's a tier C deck. I don't think it's, like, fundamentally just not a competitive deck. But Iron Thorns archetypes take a huge hit because heading into this format, decks like Dragapult and Gardevoir, which, you know, do relatively well against Iron Thorns, are going to see a major uptick in play. So that's a huge issue because both those decks do relatively well. I would say Gardevoir has a pretty favored matchup because you either play Klefki or Fluttermane. Some of them play both, so you're able to Psychic Embrace and then, you know, power up your attackers, and it becomes incredibly difficult for Iron Thorns to deal with you. And then Dragapult, you know, your ability doesn't really shut off anything in their deck, you know, relevant. So they just keep Phantom Diving over and over again, and there's not really a whole lot that I feel like just like you can do. So both those matchups are not very good. One of your best matchups in Charizard also is going to lose popularity too. So, yeah, unfortunately, Iron Thorns is a C tier deck right now. It has fallen under some hard times. Next up here, we got Chen Pao. I think Chen Pao is a tier C deck. The problem with Chen Pao is it can just get trapped. Item lock is really bad for this deck because it heavily relies on superior energy retrieval. So decks can just Budu lock things over and over again as you don't have access to superior and potentially just trap something for the entire game, which is not good. So yeah, unfortunately, item lock kind of also collaterals this deck as well. Although it hasn't been seeing a whole lot of play, it unfortunately gets hit pretty hard by the Budu. So yeah. Next up here, we got Turbo Roaring Moon. I think Turbo Roaring Moon is probably still as a tier B deck, probably more or less to the bottom. Item lock can be quite annoying, as you do rely, you know, heavily on things, you know, like Dark Patch, for example. But I still think it is fundamentally a decent deck. Does okay against things like the Archlodon. Has an okay Dragapult matchup. It's not a great matchup if they're able to slow you down early game. You kind of have to beat them by trying to run them over. But if they get, you know, like a couple turns to set up, Phantom Dive can make things very difficult. So at the moment, I think it is honestly probably bottom of tier B or top of tier C. We'll put it right there. Next up here, we got Lugia. Lugia is still very powerful. I think it's still a pretty good deck. Doesn't get necessarily hurt that much by item lock because you don't really play very many items. So it still remains as a pretty good deck. Your matchup against Archlodon is pretty decent. Your matchup against Dragapult as well is relatively, you know, fine as well. But the biggest thing that holds it back is always going to be that consistency. But I do think that it doesn't get, you know, hit by item lock that much because it just plays 4 Ultra Ball, a couple Nest Ball, Caption Aromas, and, you know, not really a whole lot of like other items. So it doesn't get hurt that much. You can simply just use research or, you know, read the wind for a turn, because a lot of these decks that are using the Budu are taking a couple turns off to set up. So you also, you know, oftentimes have that luxury. So yeah, Lugia is still pretty decent. Next up here, we got Dragapult. I think Dragapult is a fantastic deck, has been seeing some success in Japan. You know, the addition of the Budu just helps so much, giving Dragapult time. One of the biggest issues that Dragapult had in previous formats is it just kind of felt like it was getting run over. Now that's not necessarily the case. You're able to, you know, buy yourself some time, get yourself, you know, fully set up, and then start using that Phantom Dive. So overall, I think Dragapult is an incredibly powerful deck, and one of the best decks, if not the best deck, heading into next format. Next up here, we got some other turbo decks like Gouging Fire, just a, you know, average turbo deck, nothing really special about it. Terapagos gets hit pretty hard by Budu as well, just, you know, having that item lock isn't necessarily, you know, very fun to deal with, but you do, if you are able to get around item lock, or they miss like item lock, do relatively well against things like Gardevoir or Dragapult. The problem is that that's just gonna, you know, instantly slow you down and make things very difficult on you. So Terapagos definitely gets hit hard quite a bit by the Budu. Next up, we got Ancient Box. Ancient Box has been actually seeing quite a bit of success in Japan. Got second place at the Champions League most recently. I think the deck is good. I think it's very powerful. It's another deck that doesn't necessarily get crushed by item lock. You have things like Pokestop to, you know, get those ancient cards into the discard pile. You know, Budu doesn't necessarily have a whole lot of HP, so if you get, you know, turn 1 Sad as a knockout on that, you can sometimes just like run like some decks over. So yeah, I think the deck is still pretty decent. Its Dragapult matchup admittedly is not great. Its Archlodon matchup is also usually not that good as well because they can just heal over and over again. And your Gardevoir matchup is about 50-50 most of the time. So I think you do take some relatively decent matchups. I don't necessarily know if it's as good as its second place shows, but I still think it's pretty decent. Next up here, we got the Palkia decks. Both the Palkia decks I think are just very average. Both of them heavily like rely on item cards. I will say that probably Palkia Noctowl is a little bit better right now, simply because Dusknoir relies just so much on you know, having access to item cards. So I think Palkia Terapagos is at the moment going to be a bottom of tier B deck. Next up, we got Gardevoir. Gardevoir is absolutely fantastic. Just very, very good deck. Has access to Budu. Doesn't also get hurt, you know, by the item lock as well. It's just overall a great deck with Regidrago losing some steam too. It helps out its matchup spread as its matchup against Archlodon and also Dragapult are relatively good. I think that it is arguably the best deck or the second best deck in the format. We're going to put it right here. But yeah, I think that, Gardevoir is still great. Can sometimes run into some consistency problems at the beginning of games, but if you get it fully set up, it is really good. You have lots of outplay potential as well, being able to use things like Monkey Dory, trapping things with Counter Catcher, Unfair Stamp as well. A lot of agency in this deck to, take advantage of, I would say like also players who might not necessarily like resource management against you. There's just like so many things, right? So yeah, it's good. I like it. Next up here, we got Reggie's. Reggie's is it's okay. It has consistency problems. It's so fun though when you get it fully set up. It's super cool. However, item lock can definitely like slow it down. It doesn't necessarily do great versus Gardevoir, unfortunately. The Archlodon matchup is okay because you are able to one-shot with Topaz Bolt. The Dragapult matchup is kind of iffy though because they can spread and they can use things like Dusknoir if they play it to set up like multi-prize knockouts. Use like Hand Disruption. It can kind of slow you down too. So it's a really cool deck when it gets going, but the consistency is an issue. Next up here we got Lost Box. Lost Box, struggles to item lock. It doesn't do great against Archlodon, Dragapult, or Gardevoir. The problem is that they can attack you with Budew and they can just buy time. If they attack with Budew, then you can't use, Mirage Gate to, let's say, use like Moonlight Shuriken to knock out, let's say double Dreepy, or you maybe like double, Ralts or Kirlia, right? So they just buy time. They like these slow evolution decks that normally didn't actually necessarily do very good, versus Blossom Toolbox. They have now time to slow you down, and that's the issue. Because if they get fully set up, you can run into multiple problems. Next up here, we got Cloth Terapagos. I think Cloth is still a pretty decent deck. Cloth doesn't do great against Archlodon, which is an issue, and its Gardevoir matchup is rough, but your Dragapult matchup is definitely winnable, I think. Your matchups against a lot of the Turbo decks as well are still good. The problem with that is that the Turbo decks aren't going to be as popular, I think, just because of Regidrago not seeing as much play. A big reason as to why we're seeing a lot of Turbo decks in the Surging Sparks format is because they're trying to focus on taking down Regidrago. So Cloth was, oftentimes able to take a close matchup versus Regidrago, but also beat the decks that are trying to beat Regidrago. So it kind of created like that perfect storm for the deck to see success. However, with that not happening as much anymore, I do think it's going to fall a little bit more on hard times. So at the moment, it's at the bottom of tier B. Next up, we got Snorlax. Snorlax is still a solid deck in general. I still like the deck. You can definitely take advantage of players who don't necessarily know what they're doing. It's still a decent deck. Takes okay matchups against things like Gardevoir, Dragapult. I would say your Dragapult matchup is pretty sketchy, actually. It's not amazing. And then your Archlodon matchup is pretty okay. Your Lugia matchup is rough. Your Ancient Box matchup isn't necessarily great. It is winnable, but if they play Peturant, it can be quite difficult. And some of your better matchups like Charizard and Regidrago are losing popularity. So it's also a deck that I think isn't necessarily amazing right now because some of its better matchups aren't necessarily going to be as popular moving forward. Next up here, we got Pidgeot Control. Pidgeot Control is just a tier B deck. Kind of comes down to if, let's say, Dragapult can wipe the Pidgeys or Drago can wipe the Pidgeys, its consistency can sometimes be an issue. Item lock is going to cause some problems. Not necessarily a ton of problems just because it plays, Rotom, so just be able to, kind of build up a hand and, kind of get around item lock, I think, at some point. But yeah, I think Pidgeot Control is still a decent deck. Ogerpon Mimikyu is unfortunately dead. I don't think this deck is very good, just because Dragapult is able to just kind of run through this. Dusknoirs, I feel like, deal with the Mimikyus pretty easily. They can also attack with Dragalope as well. Your Gardevoir matchup is not great too. I just think it doesn't have a whole lot going for it right now. It's mainly Gardevoir matchup is just atrocious. So yeah, that's an issue. Next up here, we got Goldango. Goldango really struggles to item lock, not being able to get superior energy retrieval back. It might potentially just have to rebuild how it's, built, but I think it has some issues. Next up, the last two, we got Baynet. I don't think there's a big reason to play Baynet right now, just because Budew does a lot of what Baynet wants to do. Yes, you can attack with the Poltergeist. However, it's kind of similar to where you can use the Budew to item lock and then just go into a powerful attack after you've been able to fully set up. So it's very similar to actually what this card accomplishes, except you don't have to play an entire Baynet line. So yeah, I don't think the deck is great. I think that Budew kind of just makes this card obsolete. Next up, we got Miraidon. Miraidon, I think, is still a pretty decent deck. I don't think it's the best of the turbo decks in the format. It's kind of a little bit, I wouldn't say RNG based, but it's a little bit chaotic at times. You're very reliant on hitting your generators and stuff like that. Your matchups against Gardevoir is okay. If they do item lock you early, then you're not able to get hands. That can be really, really bad. Like that's the problem. Like if they're able to item lock, block you from hands, you have to take a 1 prize, and then they go into 2 prize like situation where they can go just like Gardevoir EX, knock out your 2 prizer, then things just kind of become a disaster after that. Your Archdon matchup is okay. If they do get fully set up and they're able to get a Dialga V-Star off, things can go south very, very quickly. And your Dragapult matchup as well, if you are able to get hands set up, I feel like in a lot of these matchups, if you are able to, get hands set up, you are oftentimes okay. But if they are able to get fully set up and the item lock can help them buy time, that's the big issue. So this is where I currently think the metagame stands. If you have any questions, thoughts, opinions, make sure to leave that in the description. But thank you so much for all the support as always. This is going to be my Prismatic Evolutions tier list. If you're interested in making this tier list yourself, make sure to go check out the link in the description. This tier list template was made by Zapdos TCG, so shout out to them. Very cool YouTuber as well. But anyways, that's going to do it for today. Thanks so much as always. This is Smart TCG, and I'll speak with you guys again soon. Peace out.